Alrighty. I guess we'll go ahead and get going. I'm getting a thumbs up, just so we don't run long. And then I'm sure people will trickle in. So hopefully you're in the right spot. This is automation and open source. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump right on in. Alrighty, so kind of just to preface this and put it in context, right? This talk really highlights everybody else's work. This really isn't anything that I've done, right? This is me kind of showing off what others have done and kind of showing how you can achieve like tangible results with it. But again, I don't think this industry would be in such a good place if people didn't share. So I'm a huge advocate, right, of kind of like share and share alike. So again, just thanks to everybody. Thanks to GrrCon for letting me give the talk. Right? So who am I? This is actually my first GrrCon, speaking or otherwise. So kind of a weird background. Did about 8 years in the Navy. I was a Korean linguist. I was a posture linguist. Wouldn't have known like a Linux server from a hole in the head. Moved into cyber, kind of in the counter-terror field. And then from there, got out, worked at RSA for a little bit. That was interesting. And then moved to a smaller company, went back to our cyber, and moved over to the offensive piece. Kind of focused on doing a lot with SIM, but a lot of kind of like on-the-fly malware analysis and actual like OCO, so offensive cyber. And then now I actually work for an automation company in Colorado. And another kind of caveat here, so even though I do work for an automation company, I don't really believe in giving like vendor pitches, right, at a venue like this. So there will be certain things that come up, right, that obviously touch on what I do on a day-to-day. But the whole purpose of this talk, right, is to really show you how to do automation within a security context with open source, right? So even though I may show very specific pieces of something, there's always another way to do it, and there's always an open source tool that'll fit. So if you have any questions, you're like, hey, I don't know what that is, or like, what else would do this, feel free to ask. There's always a lot out there. Okay, so the goal, right? From a C-level standpoint, right, like cybersecurity should be super easy at this point. You just build a team, you develop tools, you're going to suck in some sort of data, you're going to investigate that data, and then you're going to be super safe. I think that's how it works. But we know, right, that even though this is the goal, there's a lot more to it. There's a lot more facets and angles to all of this stuff. And so really what people don't know how to do is break this down into something more manageable. And part of the reason, right, to even start out with like, so what tools are in your SOC, right? So I think now at this point, like vendors have really had their hooks into the community for a long time. Vendors are really good at selling you something that sounds like the latest and greatest, and like CISOs and other managers are like, yeah, that's cool, like I'll take two. But when you actually like deploy it and try to figure out what's going on, you realize like these things don't really work together, or like we don't know like why they should work together, what they should do or what they shouldn't do. And so now, like now instead of being almost inundated with like raw data, you're inundated with data that's coming out of these tools that were bought. So you're kind of in the same situation, right? It's like this deluge of data that's totally unworkable and doesn't really mean anything. And so I think we have moved out of the point, though, where it used to be every vendor really wanted to be like the single source, right? Like if you're an RSA customer, everything's got to be RSA. Like it's not going to talk to anything if it's not RSA. ArcSite, right? ArcSite just sucks to talk to in like a broad sense. But everybody's opened up, right? So like what was the problem 5 years ago isn't the problem today, but still people don't really know how to like hook these things together. This is kind of the same thing, right? Every SOC probably doesn't have enough skilled resources. You can't retain them if you do. It's really easy to bounce. I come from DC originally where like you have about a 6-month shelf life in most SOCs, and then you can double your salary, just move down the street. We still spend a lot of time hands on keyboard when we don't have to, right? A lot of manual research is still being done, which is where automation comes in. And then, again, every analyst has their own way of doing it. Their personal workflows may not actually match up. But if you can kind of automate that and kind of diagram it out, right, that's kind of where the orchestration piece comes in. And really when we start talking about this, I think the biggest focus for any management group, right, really should be on people. I think if you invest the majority of your money and time in people, kind of the tools follow. So we talked about this being the goal, right? But what it actually looks like is, well, I want to develop tools, right? Well, do I want to develop them, right? Or do I want to buy them? Like, there's pros and cons to each, right? If you have the resources internally, developing it is probably a really good idea. But, who really has the depth of talent sometimes to say, okay, we like this, we like what it does, but I'm just going to build out like a full sim or just like full PCAP on the fly, and we'll get it up and running in like a timely manner. So it's like buy, develop. Okay, well, we're going to buy it, so we're going to demo it. Well, now we have to do some more market research after the demo. All right, well, cool, now let's POC it. Now we got to go through the procurement process, which is always like super, super short. Then like, all right, now I need somebody on their side to install it and fix it and fix it and fix it, because somehow it like never works as well as it did during that POC or during that demo. Or they're like, oh no, that's possible, but I hope you bought like 120 hours of PS, which is what I do for a living. So, all right, so now you've got the super cool, super snazzy tool. And you're like, all right, I want to ingest data, right? It's like, wait, well, what data do I want to ingest? And like, do I want all the data? It's like, well, that doesn't seem like a bad plan. It's like, well, I hope you bought storage for all that data. And so, okay, so let's say you figure out what you want to ingest, right? Well, now I need to investigate it. Well, like, where do you start? Is it just like Wireshark? Very rarely can I find someone that's like, okay, I'm just going to give you a PCAP and just tell me what's bad. Like, that's fine if it's like a single PCAP and it's a training exercise. But if it's like one PCAP out of like 1 million PCAPs, and I'm like, all right, find the bad one. And be like, what the hell? So just even know where to start an investigation, right? And like the phrase cyber hunting kind of always irks me. I like cyber hunting. I like the idea of cyber hunting. But right, cyber hunting probably doesn't get triggered off of IOCs. So when you're talking about cyber hunting, you're talking about something very free form. There's just a lot of different angles to take when you start investigating, right? So is it bad? Totally legit. You never know. And then stay safe, right? Well, the good news is you can get another job really easily, as long as you don't work in like a really small town or Vegas, as long as you don't work in Vegas. But yeah, I mean, this is like kind of what we've come to accept as normal, right? Like, it's an awful process the whole way through. And at the end of it, like, at least your average shelf life is only 2 years and you get to go do it somewhere else. But you see companies that kind of have a different mindset that I think kind of invest in people that don't have to follow this model. And they do a lot better overall. Okay, so now after my spiel, right? So like, who cares about this? Like, does anybody really care that we need to change things? So we always get up here and we kind of talk about like, well, okay, you could do it this way, or you could do it differently. But I didn't want to just come up here and say, and give you all these great ideas and but no solutions, right? No tangible solutions. So the idea, right, is that if you work in this industry or you manage a team, you manage, an entire department, you should care, right? Even if you're the analyst, you should care that you're kind of doing the best with what you have. Because every CISO in the world thinks that this is their SOC or this is what their SOC wants, right? And if you're actually in the SOC, then this is your day-to-day. And I say this also coming from an MSS background, which was eye-opening, to say the least. Okay, so we'll go back to the kind of the model, right? Those 4 bubbles. But really, this is how it should kind of be broken down. Instead of just develop tools, right? Well, kind of if you start that, and you can kind of work this from top down. That's not really how I envisioned it, but I think it works that way. You want to invest in people, right? If you're bringing in good people, good talent that mentors each other, right? And they kind of force each other to learn and kind of push each other forward, then most of these problems are going to solve themselves, right? When you enable people, all the kind of just like BS that's in there works itself out. You also want to define an end state, right? What does right look like? And then you need to kind of work backwards. If you don't know what a safe network looks like, then you're not going to know how to get there if you're just buying tools. You have to determine your weaknesses. People don't kind of reflect on their own networks a lot, and said, a lot of executives don't want to hear, well, like, this isn't patched, or, this is still a vector, or this is, an old system that we might need to kind of end of life. But if you know those, then you don't have to wait for the attackers to kind of tell you that. And then after that, then you can create the tool set. You can buy, you can develop, you can figure out what works best, right? Then instead of just investigating and ingesting data, investigating, right? Ingest data, investigate, remediate, and then I have something tangible of essentially like go back, patch, move that system, right? Do something where it's no longer kind of a vulnerability, or at least be aware of it, right? And so that's not really like a single stage. It's like you're done and you can move on. That's more like a circle, right? It's a constant process. And then in tandem, down at the bottom, red team. Especially in automation, like if you're not red teaming now, you're probably like really behind the curve, right? You need some sort of internal red team. If you outsource it, like that's cool too. But you should be constantly figuring out what's wrong with your network, fixing it, and then starting that all over again, right? That's really the only way to get better. And then at the end, right, you're not going to stay safe, but you're going to be safer than a lot of other targets out there. And if people are really going after opportunistic targets, then you probably won't get popped. And especially if you have a really good reputation out there of like, oh, these folks are like on top of their game, and like, they've caught everything we've done, they're going to go after somebody else. Okay, and so the missing piece in that whole workflow, and I don't think this gets enough press, honestly, although you do see there's some press up there. Attribution, right? So coming from the offensive side of the house, there's nothing that's going to make me not go after somebody more than my toolkit getting exposed out there, right? Like shadow broker stats, a great one. But all this stuff, right? I'm not saying it has to be to a certain point, right? It doesn't have to be like, all right, the North Korean APT, we put one guy behind it, right? But we're talking about burning stuff like infrastructure. We're talking about burning their toolkits, right? We're sharing it out to the community, right? When you can put that level of attribution to someone in your network, you can have really good results about deterring them from your network, right? Because if they're going in there and they're just doing a smash and grab job, okay, but like how often is that really the case when you're dealing with more advanced threat actors? One thing we'll get into a little bit later is, there's a great way you can, short of like spinning up full honeypots, there's ways that you can kind of gain visibility of what's going on in your network and who's in there and kind of push that back out. And I guarantee if you make it hard enough or painful enough for someone to be in your network, they'll just find someone else to go harass. So I think this really needs to be the end state for most security teams, and I just feel like this isn't where people go, right? People are like, oh, well, we got phished. All right, cool. Block the URL, delete the phish. Well, that's fine, but is it constant? Is it the same actor? Is it something that you could kind of like stem the tide on? But yeah, I don't know. I feel like a lot of people do security, but no idea what the very kind of last step should be. So that was my quick 1-minute piece on attribution. So, okay. So now we're actually going to start. So I feel like I've given enough background, right, as to why I'm kind of giving this talk. So let's actually talk about the tools that are out there. And so open source, right? So open source, especially coming from DoD, is not the best phrase you want to toss out there when you're talking about procurement. It's becoming a lot more open, and that's one of the reasons community. Like open source, the community aspect to it is awesome. Crowdsourced, right? The more eyes you have on something, the better the tool generally is. It's transparent for the most part, and it's fairly reliable, right? I think these are what everybody would say as it comes to open source is like, this is why we want it, and this is why it works a little bit better than sometimes vendor products, right? But this is what everybody says, and they go, well, we can get it for free, right? But it's not actually free. It's, it requires maintenance. It requires something so it's free. It's like the old phrase, it's free as in kittens, not free as in beer. Like, I will give you a cat, but you have to feed the cat, right? Where beer, it's not the case, right? You enjoy it once and it's done, but no, it requires upkeep after the fact. And so it can be kind of a hard sell, right? Sometimes, especially if you don't have the people in your organization to kind of maintain that. And so what is automation? This one I feel like grows every time I give this talk. I'm not really sure what automation is anymore. But the new buzzwords, you're probably going to see these if you haven't already seen them, especially during vendor pitches and Black Hat. There was a ton of this. SAO, I think SAO is kind of the dominating one, security automation and orchestration, and sometimes the R is in there because then they can say SOAR, which, yeah. So, but it's one of those versions. I think Gartner is now SOAR. But this is kind of what people talk about when they talk about automation. There's various levels of automation in things like, I don't know, like logarithm says they have automation, right? RSA says they have automation. But like automated small chunks really isn't automation, right? That's not kind of what I'm talking about. I'm talking more end-to-end type automation. Next-gen automation? Absolutely not. I hate anything with the word next-gen in it. And I think internally we might actually be using that now. So I almost winged a mouse at one of our sales engineers when I heard him say that on the phone. But I mean, if you want to sell something, just put the word next-gen in front of it. Okay, so we talk about automation. What do you automate, right? So the first thing I always say is like, well, what do you do too much of? If you ever go to a vendor conference, right, the first thing they're going to show you during a demo is phishing. It's always phishing. One, phishing is kind of easy to show, right, and most of us have to deal with it, right? Suck in an email, parse it out, score it, do whatever. It's a pretty good use case for automation, though, because phishing is just a time sink for analysts. It takes forever, right? If you have like an inbox that users forward, potential phishing emails to, even if it's like 100 a day, that's a lot to go through. So if you could automate it, right, then that's just time to save. Specifically because like 99.9% of those are going to be like spam that they got at some conference, or it's going to be like corporate comms. It's going to be some like internal email. Like very, very rarely is it like a targeted type of like phishing campaign. So anything you do too much of, we even say this for stuff like onboarding, offboarding employees. It's huge, right? It's just time consuming. And then the piece I tend to focus on, what's time critical, right? So when you're talking about, from a security standpoint, like really what are the time critical pieces? Well, like I think everybody would agree, like the most time critical thing you can do is do some sort of evidence collection, right? Some sort of triage of a box before the attacker burns off. So like watching it from the defensive side now, I think we're now in the era, right? If someone gets into your network, they're generally not going to write to disk. If they do, it's going to be like on a perimeter device. If they know what they're doing, they're going to sit on like a router on the outside. They're going to live in memory. And when they're done, they're just going to burn off. And then you're going to have a really hard time finding any sort of evidence. So to me, that's time critical. If you can get a SIM alert, how many people can really get on that box to triage that alert within a minute, right? Like almost nobody, right? Like I don't sit at a desk all day and just wait for a SIM alert to come in. Then I'm like, oh, we got one. I'm just going to go in there and like do a real quick down and dirty, like clearing of this box. So when we talk about automation, things like, all right, we got an alert, pull a netstat, pull a process list, pull an arc cache, pull a, get injected thread, if you've never used that. I know there's a newer version of it. It's awesome. It's a script that looks for hollow processes, which I think I actually have worked in the demo. And so I think I'm going to remove this third one because it really should kind of just go in a circle. But you should automate stuff that adds tangible value, right? We're in an industry that's really tough because a lot of times you get sold stuff or you have to pitch stuff, like even just internally, that the return on investment seems almost like non-tangible, right? So if you're an MSS, if you're just an internal security team, and I've spent my whole month, cyber hunting, and I haven't found anything. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean I suck at my job? Like probably, but I mean, it could mean that your system's safe. But if you can actually put time and tangible metrics, cost saving, time saving, stuff like that around automation, it doesn't really matter what the end state was. It's better if you're catching stuff than if you're not catching stuff. But if you're able to put some sort of tangible metric around these things, right, then at least you can show the return on investment to your bosses. Okay, so now a couple examples of actual tools that I've used. And yeah, I would love to meet. I don't think I've met anybody on here except for a couple of guys from PowerShell Mafia. So if you're out there and I mention your name, I'd love to meet you afterwards because I've been stealing your stuff for years, or using your stuff for years. Detection Lab by Chris Long, right? Pretty sure. Yeah. So anyone that hadn't used Detection Lab, on-demand kind of domain environment, right? He uses Vagrant and Packer. Real quick, you have something to test out, spin it up, takes like 20 minutes, and you have a full lab AD environment. Really cool, right? Not the hardest thing in the world to do manually, Super time consuming though, right? If you have to spin up 4 or 5 boxes every time you want to test something out. So again, those tangible metrics, right? I saved 20 minutes today, save 20 minutes tomorrow, stuff like that. I think this one might be a little old now. I love Empire. I love all the PowerShell post-exploitation stuff, not only because of the red teaming aspect to it, but because of the differ aspect to it. It's essentially the same thing, right? It just depends on when you use it. But again, using Ansible, spinning up a Empire infrastructure, which now they have the GUI, so it's a little dated. Grigg, I live down the street from Grigg. I bug him all the time about this. He had the right idea, right? Grigg's at Logarithm, but he open sourced this tool that's essentially kind of what I talked about, right? Takes an email, parses it out, scores it. Obviously, since he's at Logarithm, it tends to do a little more logarithm-y stuff than other open source tools would do. But it comes back, takes some sort of remediation actions. It's a really awesome tool. He's a super nice guy. Coalfire, again, more red teaming infrastructure. I won't go into all of these. Dumpster Fire. Dumpster Fire is awesome. I haven't played with it in a while. I don't know if they've made any updates or improvements. The whole premise, though, right, kind of scripted out scenarios for red teams. And so you can get really granular and say, okay, I want to kick X, Y, Z scenario off tomorrow. And then you can have, your blue team, and you can kind of correlate the results. But again, you might not have the budget for a red team, but you can still do red team activities, right? Just because you don't have like a fully dedicated group of people doesn't mean that you can't get the same kind of return on investment if you did have a fully dedicated group of people. And it's really this kind of automation, right, that makes it possible. So Dumpster Fire was really cool. I think Softworks or Teamworks, one of the SOCOM incubators was actually using that for a little while. I saw them posted it on their Twitter. Incident response stuff, right? There's so many to name. I mean, this isn't even close anymore. Invoke IR, I just tossed one up there, right? But there's about 8 billion PowerShell differ tool frameworks now. I don't remember what the little one is, but the one in white is TimeSketch. I don't know if anyone's played with TimeSketch, probably not unless you're a differ person. But what it is it's Google's open sourced timelining for incident response, for forensics, right? So it's based off of Plazo, I think. And so what you're able to do is you're able to take a disk image, toss it through, and you can automate the generation of these forensic timelines. Which again, like anyone that's had to do that manually, even just if it's like, well, I'm going through an Excel spreadsheet, it's awful, right? It takes forever to load that stuff up. If you automate it, right, that stuff can just be waiting for you. All right. So I kind of like this slide. I need to keep adding stuff more often than I do because this changes daily, right? So if someone said, all right, I have $500,000 for our security team to be spun up, well, I would say, well, spend as much of that as you can on people, right? Pay them well, and then make them build this, right? Not everything on here, but this is where I would start if I wanted to build like an open source SOC, which has been the topic of a lot of talks out there. But for SIMs, security onions, I think security onions kind of become the standard for open source SIMs and stuff that people have tried to build on. At the same time, Elastic has come a long way. Helk is awesome. I don't think they give a talk about it here, but they've been given a couple talks, and Helk is one of the coolest things. It takes a bit of configuration to get going though, right? But with some of the new stuff, and I forget what the newest integration is. I think it might be MITRE. Yeah, it might be MITRE with attack, which is, again, something everybody wants but doesn't really know what they want to do with it. They're like, oh, MITRE and attack. But they've worked it in a really cool way. So again, all of those are things you could use. Endpoint. All right, PowerShell, definitely like the poor man's endpoint. And if you allow PS remoting throughout your environment, then hey, like go hog wild. That doesn't seem necessarily like all the time the best idea. But if you log and you know what to look for, right, and you know how your commands are being issued, then it's not bad. OS query is great. Originally by Facebook, I believe, right? So it's great. It wraps the endpoints essentially as like a SQL database, and you can run SQL commands to pull back information. automation, right? Kind of the piece we were talking about here. Python's awesome for it, right? Then there's a little bit of a caveat there that says if you're having all this Python as your back-end automation, then you're going to start getting these kind of unruly sets of scripts, and then you need to put some sort of build your own framework around it. Okay, I get that. Same with PowerShell. And in fact, yesterday, Dan Cow, I think it was, from Target, gave a talk that we could have totally done the talk together. His was just a shorter version of mine. And that's what he does, right? He has a lot of PowerShell scripts, and I think he even writes some that just do the native window calls. And that's what he did, is he kind of built this framework around a lot of PowerShell commands. Other stuff, Fido. Fido is old in terms of like open source. I think it's at least 3 or 4 years now. It was developed by Netflix, and I have no idea why it failed or why it didn't gain any traction. I've tried to reach out to the guy. I never heard back from him. I don't know if he works at Netflix anymore or not. But it seemed like a super cool open source idea, right? For automation, it was just an automation framework, a lot like what some people sell. Stackstorm, awesome tool. It's still very modular, very granular in the way that it's spun up, but that is probably the closest thing on there I can say as far as an open source end-to-end automation solution. If you really need automation, you have good talent, you have good people that can kind of double as developers, I totally recommend checking out Stackstorm. Turbine, that will be our open source tool eventually. It's almost done. Collide. Collide probably shouldn't be under pure automation. Collide wrote Fleet. Fleet is the GUI front-end management piece that they built for OS Query. So OS Query is great because you can deploy it out to all your endpoints and do these super cool searches. Collide, it just brings that together under one management pane. Enrichment, right? This is kind of the piece when you're talking about automation that nobody really knows what to do with. So you ingest data, you ingest an alert, right? You make a ticket or something. This ticket comes in. All right, well, it's just binary on my system. What do I need to enrich it with? Like, what really matters? Well, VirusTotal, everybody's go-to thing. If it's not necessarily a network type alert, right, and you don't need the netstats, the ARP caches, the PS lists, the WinEnums, stuff like that, then maybe it's more of a phishing type attempt, right? Maybe OTX is really good. Maybe Spiderfoot. Ember by Ingame is a great one. But again, things like Spiderfoot, I don't know if Spiderfoot is still free. They haven't charged me yet, and I'm on their new, whatever, HX. But if no one's used Spiderfoot before and you're doing OSINT, it's great. Have I been pwned? Also way underutilized. You know, you can do the ad hoc single queries of saying, hey, was this username seen anywhere? But if you have act as your web admin, right, for your domain, you can also get verified, and then they will send you an alert every time that someone with that domain, their creds pop, right, on a breach. All right, so now for the demo, because we are flying through this. So I'm going to go really slow on the demo. And so again, this is the product I work with all the time. If you like what you see, but you're like, dude, we're not going to pay for it, I mean, you're more than welcome to pay me. But again, you can do this in any of these products I just listed, right? So coming in, I have to look at this on the screen. So coming in as an analyst, right? Most of these automation capabilities have some sort of dashboarding. If not, you can tie it in pretty easily. And what you're able to see kind of right off the bat with everything being color-coded is just like severity, right? This is normal SOC stuff. This isn't anything fancy yet. And so from that, you're able to see, okay, cool, I had a critical alert, right? All the normal ticket management stuff is at the top. They're able to claim the ticket. They're able to see it's an endpoint alert. Now, how well, that is like really tiny. But you're able to just see all the normal like metadata that would go with a ticket, right? Came from this system, needs attention. Other things with automation there, right? So when people say, well, if I'm automating a network alert, what other things, right? Not just like, what am I pulling off of that host? What ancillary data do I need? Things like this. You might not be able to see it. It's called a high-value asset, right? So if you hold a list of all your high-value assets and servers in your system, then you'll know, like, okay, this guy clicked a link for, he got in an email, right? What was that, like, John's, box? Or was it, like, the CEO's box, right? It matters, and how quick you need to do some sort of triage on it. So you're able to automate that piece, like, just to know, really, like, have that idea, like, what was this thing? Are there any other associated alerts, right? That's another thing that's very manual, a very manual process of having to kind of pull all that together. I'll go back to that one. Notes, right? Almost all the automation solutions you can find in open source have some sort of like note taking. Again, they're very case management, ticket management-y. So as you go in, again, you're going to have some sort of the alarm info, the host, the source, the alarm type, the user, right? The file name, the domain. This is no more than just mapping the fields from wherever you're pulling in the alert. The alert body, right? You generally just want to toss in if it's Ceph, if it's syslog, whatever. You probably want the raw alert in there for the analyst. Threat intel, right? Some sort of content enrichment, ancillary searches, whatever. In this one, virus total, have I been pwned? People use, whatever they have. Oh, another great one, gray noise, if anyone's seen this one out there. I haven't seen their presence a lot at cons yet, but it's essentially a threat intel feed for the false positives that'll be hitting your network. It's really cool. And then attachments are attachments. And so when we start looking actually at, though, okay, well, you automated some of this, but like, why does it matter? Well, okay, say I had a malicious binary dropped on my network, right? Okay, so it matters if I downloaded it, if I executed it. But what really matters is, well, what became of it? So in this scenario, we have some of the ancillary actions that aren't just based off of that one host. Things like query the SIM, right? Where else did that file hit, right? Who else downloaded that binary? And then, what was the other one I have? Oh, what URL did it come from, right? Was that URL seen across my network? Was it doing different stuff on different machines? Just wasn't related to that file. Because you don't know if you're hitting someone's actual like payload delivery node. Maybe you're seeing like their long haul. You just kind of don't know what you don't know. Lateral movement, right? This is one of the best ones, especially if you're going up against kind of a low-level target or maybe some newer red teamers. If you pop my box, you grab my creds, the first thing people are going to want to do is laterally move somewhere, right? So if you're able to automate the search, right? John's box got popped. Well, John was also logged in 12 other places. That's probably not normal, right? That's a really good indication of lateral movement. So now you can say, well, okay, now this investigation has moved from this one host. Looks like he's gone out here. Well, now we can do the same on these 12 hosts, right? Where else has he moved? And then the actual host info, which is kind of what I've been talking about the whole time here. These are the pieces, right? So in this case, you would have gone in. WinEnum is like a real quick way to grab things like running processes, installed applications, some registry information, uninstalled applications, right? Things like that. And everybody has stuff that's kind of unique to their own different process. And so it doesn't really matter what you automate, it's just that you're automating those initial steps. And so the next piece will be a netstat. Obviously, netstats are always super important. See who's connecting where. Same with ARP caches, right? You're only going to catch ARP caches for a hot second once the attacker's on there. Processes, same deal. Again, I use get-injected-thread a lot when I'm running stuff remote, and get-injected-thread checks for hollow processes. So you're able to go in. If it returns a result, that's usually a pretty bad indicator, but you can go in and check that PID, and you go back. Now you already have the information, right? You already know, okay, hey, this, like something was super wrong with this. And I think in this case I use like Empire just to hollow out probably LSAS. That tends to be where I go. But again, if you're automating at this level, right, then it doesn't really, you're no longer kind of behooving to your analysts to get on there within like 2 or 3 minutes. You've automated the time critical piece. They might not get to this alert for an hour, but all the evidence is there for them, right, to go and kind of do the investigation after the fact. Where if you're just like, no, we don't really automate, like, yeah, maybe our, net witness box or whatever probably grabbed it. We'll just do the investigation and hunting from there. Like, you're just really kind of like hamstringing yourself for no reason, right? The attackers don't have those kind of rules on them, and they have a lot more flexibility. So coming from the defensive side, right, where we can build in flexibility is kind of where you should build in flexibility, if that makes sense, right? Like we don't have kind of the hands-off mentality where they really do. And then I think that's actually going to wrap up that part of the demo. I don't know why it's got 30 seconds left. I'll let this keep running in case it gets to something else. Another thing that people I've kind of helped set up automate, and this idea isn't new at all, but I think people are warming up to it. Automate kind of poisoning files around your network, right? We use Empire for it, and what we do is actually we set up a fully, just like a normal Empire like C2 infrastructure. You can embed payloads in Word documents. Now in the new versions of Empire, you can kind of get payloads into anything, right? You can get payloads into like Python files, so you can make it look like stuff you're developing. You poison that around your network, right? Files that people shouldn't be opening and clicking and moving and exfilling. When they open it, depending on obviously what security they have on their end, right? It beacons back. You're able to catch, so ByteBleeder has a really great script out there called Death Star, which hooks into Empire. You can have that just kind of run, do a triage of the box of whoever opened that file, right? And then when you get in, you go, oh hey, I got a super critical alert. Someone pulled that dummy file down, opened it. This is kind of what we know about them. And then you can say like, okay, maybe it was just someone stupid poking around, but maybe it was something like a legitimate attacker, right? We've seen that a lot, and they actually had really good results with it. So just something to consider. And so, kind of at this point, right? So kind of this is like a final thought. Automation, right? Automation really helps us put the focus where it should be, which is on people. To me, right, a big thing of quality of life. If you're not having to sit and triage, 1,000 alerts today, you're going to have a lot more time to go to the cons, to get out there to kind of build your knowledge on other topics and just kind of like enjoy your life more. I think that's something that we've all kind of assumed isn't going to happen working in this field. You're going to be doing 60, you're going to be doing 80-hour weeks, right? Which you really don't have to. The problem is that we now realize that like cyber security is almost an overwhelming task, no matter what tools you have. But if you can really remove 99% of the noise in there, you can make a better go at it. And I've had good luck with automation in doing that. And so if you do want to contact me, that's just my work email. You're always free to shoot me a line about any of these tools. It's my Twitter handle. I don't tweet. I retweet because I take people's stuff all the time, and I have to remember where it came from and figure out what I was doing with it. But you're more than welcome to follow me on there. If you DM'd me, I think you'd probably be my first direct message on Twitter. I don't have a LinkedIn anymore. I had, I think my Twitter profile was the same as my LinkedIn, where it had the Ronald Reagan mask from Point Break, and they didn't like that. And so at this point, are there any questions? Yep. So I'll say this, right? So yeah, so definitely at a broad view, these things do not like skimpy hardware, right? I feel like for all the cool stuff we're building, they're still beefy. Helk, especially. Helk, I think it says minimum we want like 16 gigs, and that's like a small lab instance. Like I would not recommend doing that. But I'll say this, drilling for automation, you're gonna have the separate pieces. You're gonna have some sort of front end, web app, whatever, right? That can be like your lowest resourced box. Then you're gonna have like what I think we would call a task engine, right? task engine is just going to be the piece running the automation. That actually probably doesn't need as much as most people think, because it's really just, it's concurrently running those threads. And I think most people get away with 16 to like 32 gigs, and the backend disk doesn't matter as much. The database is super critical. Everybody somehow is like, oh, it's just databases, it's just storing data, right? It can be like super slow. No, like you should go the other way. The fastest things you have possible, like and available, put it on the databases for sure. And I think if you scale like that, people have had way better luck. Whereas like sometimes we'll have this person be like, oh no, we gave like 128 gig RAM and it's like still super slow. It's like, well, yeah, it's like you might as well be running like tape in the background though on your databases. So I would say, yeah, I don't know of any I've seen that are like, I would say, oh yeah, they're super streamlined. They don't work well streamlined. I feel like, yeah, that's kind of the norm now, right? And then AWS doesn't help in the fact that like it's kind of expensive. But if you have on-prem stuff, it's a lot easier to kind of juggle those resources. Got two over there. Oh, I'm past the black curtain. Sorry. Sure. Yeah. I mean, I obviously know Phantom really well, right? They're a competitor of ours. But no, I like what they do for putting stuff out to the community for sure, right? I didn't know it was open source. I know they had a community edition, but in the same vein, I'm all about community editions too, right? If you can't get open source, but you can get a community edition that does 90% for you, that's still awesome. But no, I like what Phantom do. We're very similar, right? So, again, and anybody that puts stuff out to the community, right? That's good by my book. Yeah, so I think you're going to see more this way, right? I think because of the way the space started, right? And it started with the Phantoms, it started with the swim lanes, right? It started with the Demistos. And they came out as kind of these separate entities but I think you're seeing it converge now, right? I think in 2 or 3 years, you're not going to see a huge differentiator. I think a lot of vendors are going to have it built in, even internally, right? Like we use it for a lot of stuff that's not SOC related, right? That wouldn't probably not be sold to people as like SAO or SOAR or whatever. So I think they're doing the same thing. I think they're just going to meet like this though, because they're starting to use all the same tools. It used to be I never had a requirement for people to do things like with like Ansible, right? But now we use like NetMiko all the time to issue Ansible commands. So I think you're seeing them come together. Slow head turn. Is that a question or is that a get off the stage? I'm sorry? Client installs? Oh, you mean like on like an endpoint? Um, oh yeah, OS query is. So those are, and that's why I actually use Fleet by Collide a lot when I do OS query, because it'll manage those. You'll say, hey, push it out to these. You'll either say, I think you can do a push, but it also, when you spin up your whole management framework, it'll say, you know, for Mac or for Linux or for Windows, here's the binary you need to drop on there, and then it'll just kind of like beacon home. I think that's the biggest one. Obviously, PowerShell, you don't really have to have like a client install per se. There's a lot of other stuff. Noah was really good. That was open source. It was no agent something. But yeah, I think OS query would be the closest on all of those that would have like a client endpoint. Mm-hmm. Yep. And I will say like Fleet and I guess Collide in general has one of the best user communities. They have a great Slack channel. So one of the things I was trying to do was trying to automate the actual API calls because they have a really nice API on the back end. They don't tell you about it though, right? And so I was like, I think all these are making API calls. I can see like half of it. And so I just hit them up on Slack, and they were like, oh yeah, we'll just go and open DevTools. You know, you need to look like it's nested down here. And I was like, oh, was this in your documentation? And they're like, oh no, we would never put that in our documentation. I was like, oh, okay. But yeah, I mean, as far as like a really good free endpoint agent, OS query, yeah, is awesome. And I think GitHub, right, or GitLab, someone uses it internally along with Facebook, and there's a bunch of other ones. Anyone else? I don't see any hands. Well, if you do have any questions, I'll be around for a little bit. I'll always talk over coffee or beer. And if not, feel free to reach out. So that's my talk. Thank you all very much.